Well, at the end of chapter 9 and the start of chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, you might remember that the Apostle Paul gave us two examples for the Christian life. The first example was a really positive example, but the second example was actually a negative example. The first positive example came at the end of chapter 9, and it was the example of an athlete, someone who is in a race and someone who disciplines their body and has laser sharp focus at finishing the race well. Paul says that's a positive example of you and your Christian life, because the Christian life is like a race. And so you should discipline your body to put sin to death and have laser sharp focus at finishing the race well, so that you might receive the imperishable wreath and reward at the end of your life. But the second example he gave was the start of chapter 10, and that was actually a negative example. And quite ironically, the negative example came from God's own people in the Old Testament, the Israelites. Even though they had been given great privilege, they'd seen God move in ways that anyone else could only imagine. They were largely a generation of unbelievers, disobedient to God's law. And so to sum up those two examples, Paul in verse 14 says this: "Therefore, my beloved," in light of those two examples, "flee from idolatry." Therefore, my beloved brothers, flee from idolatry. Paul says, do not be like the Israelites. Do be like the athlete, and in summary, flee from idolatry. And as he deals with this church in Corinth, the Apostle Paul then really puts his finger on the pulse and pinpoints the one area where these Corinthians had found themselves becoming compromised. Read with me from verse 15 to 21. It says, "I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then, that food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons." As you read through this passage the first time, it may seem a little bit contradictory to what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. You might remember back then the Corinthians were asking the question, is it okay for me to eat meat which is pagan, which may have previously been offered to false gods? And Paul's answer to that question was really yes, it is okay, provided you do not cause your brother to stumble. And as you read this passage, it almost seems that Paul is contradicting himself, that he's saying, actually no, it's not okay for you to eat pagan meat. But Paul's not contradicting himself, rather he's putting his finger on the pulse of one area or one context where eating pagan meat would be wrong. Just as the context in chapter 8 was, it's not okay to eat pagan meat when you're causing your brother to stumble. Here he gives another example of a very important piece of context. He's referring to the public pagan feasts that were prominent in Corinth. There, pagan meat was obviously served, but if you were to eat pagan meat at one of these public pagan feasts, you were really symbolically associating yourself with the false god. And so Paul says, while in a general sense it's okay to eat this meat which may have been previously offered to the pagan gods, it's not okay to do it at one of these public pagan feasts, because participating in that meal then is you symbolically associating with the false gods who are being worshipped. And the parallel he draws really is with the Lord's Supper. Of course, you wouldn't say to a non-believer that they're not free to drink wine or eat bread. They're free to do those things in a general sense. But you would not encourage a non-believer to eat bread and drink wine in the context of a communion service. Why? Because in a communion service, you are symbolically associating yourself with the blood and the body of Christ. That's the point of communion. We remember Christ. And so while in a general sense it's okay for an unbeliever to eat bread and drink wine, in the context of a communion service it's altogether different. And Paul says it's the same with these public feasts in Corinth. In a general sense it's okay for you to eat this meat, but not in the context of these public worship feasts, because that would associate you with these false gods. And so Paul says don't do it. Really, he says in verse 21, you can't have your foot in both camps. You must choose today who you'll serve. Look at verse 21, he says this: you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. To do so, Paul says, verse 22, would stir up the Lord's jealousy. Now, jealousy is a characteristic that we kind of think is an ugly characteristic. But we do well to remember the difference between envy and jealousy. Envy is to desire something that is not rightfully yours, but jealousy is to desire something which is rightfully yours. And so Paul says God, when he looks at us worshipping other things other than the thing we were created to worship, provokes his jealousy. He wants us to worship him and be brought back into relationship with him, the one who created us and made us and formed us for himself. And so here's your challenge for today. Paul says here, we cannot live a compromised Christian life. We cannot try and have our foot in both camps. We must either worship God or worship something else. What do you worship? Where in your life do you find yourself being compromised? Perhaps a good question to ask yourself is this: what do you think most about? What excites you most? What do you find yourself talking about most? That might give you a bit of a clue as to what your idol might be. Hope you have a great day.